Akin to her old habits, Mabel left her shoes by the door, bracing herself against the bitter chill of the nighttime without so much as a sock. She braced herself against the nearest walls, shaking fingers digging into the wooden panels as she attempted to study unfamiliar ground. The colored panes of the nearby window cast an ominous shadow across the landing. Something deep in her chest feeling extremely unnerved. The sound of her steps alone chipped at her confidence, but stubborn determination failed to give way to the feel of the empty air behind her. She dove into the unknown by herself a handful of times before, but this would be the first time doing so at night. In retrospect, it was an advantage. The darkness offered protection and momentary comfort, much in the same way as Dipper's presence did. She latched onto the feeling, gripping onto any form of partnership to help her through the mission as she found herself moving down the steps. Mabel expected constant noise from the ever-settling house, but it sat completely quiet. As if time had frozen, everything around her and left her to wander in a silent wasteland. Her bare foot slipped off the last step, and she paused at the entrance to the living room. A multicolored glow cast a strike of light across her path, and Mabel peered in hesitantly. No matter how many times she studied the house, crazy and minuscule details evaded her. The axolotl tank and the battered box television, the culprits of the glowing light, finally offered faint noises to cut through the silence. The caretaker's form slumped in a ragged couch across from the TV, his bulky form reminding Mabel of photos of hibernating bears in the library's geographic magazines. His white wife-beater revealed itself through an unbuttoned suit top. A golden chain glistened on his chest. A ratty green Afghan half hid his bulky shape amongst the TV's flickering. Deep rumbling snores convinced Mabel she hadn't been hearing white noise in her ears after all. She watched him for any indication he was awake, her eyes lifting to the silky red fez sitting precariously atop his head. He remained still as a ridiculously snoring bear could be. Mabel shifted her attention to the kitchen in front of her, gazing into a similar form of darkness that all kitchens appeared to possess. She stumbled as she moved, pitching her hands forwards and crouching onto cold linoleum as she pressed herself into the darkest shadows by the doorway. The kitchen, once tastefully old-fashioned, now lay in a jumbled and mismatched mess, just like its brethren room next door. Knickknacks adorned the counters, alongside dented pots and pans. Food wrappers and pit cola cans littered every visible surface. The peeling wallpapers had turned a hideous, grimy color, contrasting against lacy curtains covering a dusty window. One tile in the middle of the kitchen was missing, and a table leg was propped up with a book so massive, even Dipper's nerdy face wouldn't want to be shoved into it. Mabel clenched her jaw at the sight of the mess, seeking out a multitude of hiding places before moving directly into that chaos. She counted off the necessities on her fingers. A rag to cover her twin's wound, some water both to drink and wash his injuries, and something to disinfect it. The first aid kit they'd kept on them constantly had been one of the first things confiscated before they were shipped off, but they'd memorized the components they'd most often use. They boiled down to 3 major objects they could find just about anywhere. Mabel crept around the kitchen, digging through cabinets and drawers in a quick but efficient, thorough manner. She let the cabinet doors slam shut on her hands to avoid slamming, and her fingers screamed in protest once she'd pulled a relatively clean rag from the bottom drawer. One drawer held nothing but old, dirty utensils and bent straws. Another held a small array of knives, and Mabel shut it quickly. A cabinet stored a variety of canned food, and she picked off one of the peaches from the overflowing piles before moving on. Finally, she managed to spot an old empty water bottle laying by the humming refrigerator, missing its cap. She clambered over to the sink, silently turning on the tap and filling it to the top before balancing it on the counter. The pile of plastic bags on the tabletop had been the first thing to catch her attention, and she found her eyes pulled in its direction again. But she'd vowed to deliberately avoid them, ignoring the reflective surface and the blazing store logo. Until Dipper finished logging Stan's style of living, she had to pick off things that wouldn't be noticed at first glance, and something as small as a store receipt would identify her as a thief in no time. Her eyes moved to the cabinets above the counters, far above her reach. Mabel threw the rag over her shoulder, climbing up the nearest chair and anchoring her hands against the counter. With a quiet heave and a harsh puff of air through her nose, she pulled herself up onto the surface. She stood tentatively, carefully straightening herself up to her feet as her hands traced along the cabinets until they found the handles. One by one, she began her search all over again. A long snore, punctuated with ragged breaths, boomed from the living room and startled her for a split second. She tossed a quick look over her shoulder, but the caretaker remained in his comfy chair without so much as a shift of his hand. Adrenaline resurfaced, coursing through Mabel's veins as she pulled open the first set of cabinets. The rows of empty and dusted shot glasses greeted her, and she wrinkled her nose in distaste. The second set produced nothing but old mugs and a model replica of what looked to be a boat. The last set proved different than the others. An old, rusted lock dangled from one handle, its owner apparently having unlocked it after one too many uses and lacking the care to replace it. With throbbing fingers, Mabel lifted it onto her palm and studied it for a second before moving the handles and throwing the cabinet doors open. Light bounced against the glass. The stale smell of alcohol hit her in a wave of familiarity, and Mabel blinked at the hidden liquor stash in front of her. The panicky sense in her gut urged her to immediately dig forward, but inexperience rightfully held her back. Dipper had only ever been the one to steal alcohol. Teenagers in past households had utilized him as their delivery boy, trading used cigarettes and food scraps to send him on dangerous expeditions that he never failed to carry out. Dipper's reputation held strong when he swiped a can of beer right under his foster father's nose, and another child nearby had consequently taken the blame. Mabel had had her fair share of liquor, and she absolutely loathed the taste, but stealing it became an entirely different matter. It was a whole other ballpark she'd never even considered stepping foot into, allowing her brothers to run all the bases he'd like as she watched. One wrong bottle missing, and Mabel wouldn't have even had the time to fathom their impending death. It had to be done. She pushed down tremors attempting to take over her hands as she reached forward, wrapping her fingers over the neck of a random bottle. Completely empty. She set it by her foot to reach for a different one behind it. She pulled out a uniquely shaped bottle of bourbon next, its glass sparkling with minuscule bits of burst of color. Not sufficient. The caretaker would miss it almost immediately. Mabel spent a few seconds marveling at the material that shimmered under her thumb. The glasswork, a spectacle, even under the dim light of the kitchen. Reluctantly, she set it down next to the empty bottle, now lifting herself onto her toes to dig through the cabinet. Her hand closed around a smaller sized bottle, its tiny form tucked away discreetly, and she knew this would be it. She pitched it forwards, her arm wobbling a bit at the weight. It was completely full, but topping it off with water for the time being could at least hide the contents used. However, as the bottle dropped off the edge of the cabinet, Mabel realized too late she'd underestimated the weight. The bottle nearly plunged and slipped from her fingers, and she shifted her feet to catch it in her arms. Her foot slipped a few inches too far. The bourbon bottle tipped off the counter as if trapped in slow motion, and Mabel had no choice but to watch as everything crashed to the ground in a flurry of sound. The water bottle dropped with a quiet thunk. An anticlimactic beginning that became immediately outmatched as a bourbon exploded across the linoleum. The empty bottle shattered into millions of crystalline pieces. Mabel screamed, finding herself losing balance, within seconds plummeting towards the floor. Split-second instinct took over. Clutching the bottle to her chest, she yanked herself to the side with such a quick leg movement that it sent spasms of pains through her thigh. She landed to the left of the mess into a mixture of bourbon and water, a thick shard of glass centimeters from her shoulder. A high-pitched noise sliced through her eardrums, the cacophony swelling and causing terror to bloom in her chest until she'd realized the noise was coming from her. Everything blurred together. Her head hurt, and for a handful of seconds, she felt she could see stars scattered across the darkness underfoot, and she was floating in the midst of it, in a cold, chilled embrace. It snapped back as quick as it happened. Instead of stars, she was surrounded by glass, and the chill was only the bourbon and water seeping through the back of her shirt. She somehow felt the movement in the next room, and her body screamed at her to hide. Movement returned to her limbs, jerking them like robotic parts of a clunky machine, as she subconsciously dove behind the fridge. Stabs of pain shot through the underside of her feet, her big toe bleeding and her fingers throbbing in time with her rapid heartbeat. She crouched in the shadows without really understanding how she even got there. And suddenly, light flooded the kitchen, blinding her, seizing her limbs with such gripping, paralyzing terror that all she could do was sit and wait.